Now, that said, what about dairy? There's lots of carnivores out there eat dairy. There's lots of people out there eating dairy, and they might be doing well with it, but I certainly don't. So the problem with dairy is really how well you handle digesting what's in the dairy. Now, rumor has it, although I can't verify this, but rumor has it that for those who are able to get their hands on raw dairy, that's very difficult to do in Canada. In Canada, you'd be better off robbing a bank than trying to sell raw dairy. Raw dairy, because it has enzymes and other factors which are basically destroyed by pasteurization, can actually be digested more easily by some people. So in the hierarchy of dairy, I would say if you can get raw dairy, that's probably better. In the hierarchy of dairy, I would say if you get it as yogurt or cheese, for adults, it's probably better than fresh milk. And the biggest issue there is that there is some indication that fresh milk is, as they call it, insulinogenic, which means it drives insulin levels. And for most of us, as we get older, we will have more and more of a tendency to be insulin resistant, which means an insulinogenic food will maybe drive our insulin up even higher than it would for a younger person. So I've heard Dr. Ken Berry, he is one of the carnivore influencers out there, say that milk is meant to grow baby mammals up, right? Good for their brains, lots of minerals, building structure, beautiful food for them, right? But for full-grown mammals, it builds you out this way. So I would look at, first of all, whether or not I'm at a good weight. If I tend to be on the heavier side, dairy might not be my food, or it might be that I have to stick to ones where there's less lactose, less sugar present, and eat it in small quantities. So that would be back to yogurt, maybe kefir, maybe cheese. But the other issue with dairy is the casein itself. So casein is one of two milk proteins. You have whey protein and you have casein protein that's in milk products and dairy products. Whey protein is easily digested, easily absorbed. So most of us do okay with whey. Although if you have kind of a general problem with dairy, whey might trigger you as well. But casein is a whole other ballgame. So with casein, we have more than one structure to the molecule. So you have a casein called A1 and a casein called A2. Not very descriptive. Let me give you some more information. A1 is the typical casein from cow's milk. So we bred cattle to produce more milk. Those newer breeds, including the black and white Holstein that most of us would know, those have casein that is called A1. The better tolerated form of casein is A2, and A2 comes from older breeds of cattle, and that would include things like Guernseys, like the Swiss brown cow, and breeds where they didn't somehow go through this genetic change. That A2 casein is sometimes better tolerated, and so for some people that can take you from I can't do dairy to I can do dairy. I did that experiment on myself. I was not successful, so it really does depend on how committed your body is to reacting to dairy. Mine's fairly committed at this point. So I do not have a lot of it. And when I do have it, sometimes I'll have a little bit of a gut upset. So it's very rarely and far between at this point. The problem for most of us is then if we're not eating dairy, and this is even in the omnivore world, if we're not eating dairy, we are losing a food source which is very, very rich in minerals. And that's a big deal in the oxalate world because oxalate is a mineral chelator. So we can be depleted by minerals or depleted of minerals by oxalate as oxalate's leaving our body. So we don't necessarily want to be eating a diet where we're not getting enough minerals. But, what if we don't tolerate supplements well? Or what if we're a carnivore and we're trying not to take supplements? There's real reasons to think about where we're going to get our minerals from. And so what I would say to you is this: if you go back far enough, even in human history, milk and cheese would not have been daily parts of people's diets, but their water source was often from wells. And those wells, that water would have had minerals in it. So I'm very suspicious that whether you're talking about surface water that people could collect from a stream or a river, or you're talking about wells that people would have hand dug, or artesian springs and things like that, most water in the natural world will have dissolved minerals in it. And I suspect this is one of the best ways for us to get minerals. When we think about these kinds of mineral waters, I really think about a couple of brands which are both carbonated, so you can also look for still mineral water. But from a carbonation standpoint, because bicarbonate's actually good for us, so again, depends on what you tolerate. But there's a brand called Gerolsteiner, and that is from Europe. The name of the brand is spelled Gerolsteiner, Gerolsteiner. And that particular mineral water in a liter, which is a little less than a quart, provides you 500 milligrams of calcium. Like, it's a lot. And I think we have to think about this carefully too, because someone might say, well, the RDA is a lot more than 500 milligrams. And I'd say, but the RDA assumes that we are getting our minerals from sources where maybe 100% of that mineral is not available. So a great example would be, the RDA assumes that we can get lots of calcium from broccoli, for instance. Well, in fact, some of that calcium is bound to oxalate. And while broccoli is not a high oxalate food, there is some oxalate in there. So you're not going to absorb 100% of that calcium that's available. So it might be, that food might be tested and it might indicate X amount of calcium, but that doesn't mean you're going to get it all. And when it comes to supplements, it's well known that if you take, say, 500 milligrams of calcium, that doesn't mean you absorb 500 milligrams of calcium. But when you're talking about dissolved calcium in water, so it's ionic, there's almost no effort on our body's parts to be able to absorb that from the gut, then I'm thinking you're going to get pretty much 100% of that. So do you need to then get the whole RDA if you're consuming a certain amount of mineral water? I'd argue, I don't think you do. I think that you can look at these kinds of sources and say, if I'm getting it as dissolved in water, I'm more likely going to absorb 100% of it. And if my diet is low oxalate at the same time, I'm not binding it with something. And so I'm getting the benefit of every calcium molecule that I take in. That puts you in a whole different place in terms of calcium. The only thing we need to be worried about if we're getting a lot of ionic calcium like this is that you get enough magnesium. Calcium and magnesium are the yin and yang to each other. You need them to balance each other out. When you're getting too much calcium and you don't have enough magnesium, that can actually apparently contribute towards calcium being deposited places you don't want it, like as stones or like in your arteries. So we want to handle some of this in a little bit of a nuanced way. So I do like mineral water. I will generally drink that kind of around a meal so that there's going to be some food to kind of slow it down and I'm not getting this big bang dose of minerals all at once. And then in between meals, I'm probably going to not drink something that's as high mineral content as something like Gerolsteiner. You can also look at supplements where you've got calcium ions in water with a measurable dose so that you can add a little bit of this to your water all day long, but no big bang dose, not these kind of higher levels like you have in the Gerolsteiner that I mentioned. So there's multiple ways to handle it. And I would absolutely look at mineral water as at least part of my calcium. I would look very carefully at whatever I'm eating and what calcium's there. And perhaps in the show notes, I can include a list of foods which are higher calcium and lower oxalate so that you can think about including those in your diet. And certainly if you're eating a more carnivore diet, there is calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, and different minerals in meats. It's worth knowing which ones are good sources of which minerals, and I'll put together a list like that as well. So if dairy is not your friend, don't worry. I am not eating any dairy, but I am drinking some still mineral water from a company where their product is called Flow. There are some interesting online resources that will help you to find local mineral springs. There's something like that in Ontario. I'm pretty sure you're going to find it in other areas as well. I would take a look at that. Natural mineral water, as long as you know it's how clean it is. And most of these resources will also tell you, yeah, it's an artesian well, it's really exceptionally clean, or, it's in the midst of farmland. Maybe there's some runoff things to be concerned about. But, in most cases, if you can get some good information on the kind of spring water that's available where you are, you may find something that's quite a good source.